everybody. I'm just going to speak for a couple of minutes. Essentially, as you know, my father was British, but he very much enjoyed his years in New York and was very fond of his friends here and his life here. And since none of you, I don't think, were able to come to the funeral, and I don't think hardly anyone would manage to come to the memorial we're having in London on March 17th, although you're very, very welcome in case any of you are in London then. I thought it'd be nice to get a few friends of his together, so thank you for coming, and thank Judith for arranging it, and Jean for graciously hosting us. And what I thought would be nice, since it's a relatively small number of people, is if you like, I can repeat what I said at the funeral, which was 3 or 4 minutes long, which was in London just 2 days after he died. And then if anybody else wants to add any kind of anecdotes or little stories or something, I don't want it to go on too long, but if somebody wants to contribute, it'd be nice if you're interested. So, yeah. Shall I read out?
Yes.
Yes.
I'll keep it just in case.
I think it's a virgin.
Got vodka in here. Okay. So this was written rather off the cuff because we weren't even sure. We weren't sure exactly. We didn't know obviously he was going to die until he died, and then it was quite a hasty arrangement of the funeral and so on. So I just jotted down some notes and made some remarks, which were as follows. My father was an exceptional person. I have known that all my life, of course, but nevertheless, I've been taken aback by the outpouring of grief and admiration for him in the last 3 days, including wonderful letters and emails from all over the world, and magnificent tributes in the press on both sides of the Atlantic and in continental Europe too. My father had an outstanding intellect, but because of his modesty, I hadn't quite realised to what extent his intellectual prowess went back to his earliest days until reading some of the tributes this week, and I'm referring of course to the 2nd week of January now. On Wednesday in the Times of London, a Mr. Derek Taylor wrote a letter to say that he had been at the Perth School in Cambridge with my father. Mr. Taylor wrote, "There was a school debate one day in 1946. The speakers were always 16ers, but John was 11 at the time, and astonished the audience by standing up to make his point, quoting for his purpose the Russian Foreign Minister of 1927. It was a moment not to be forgotten. And yesterday in the Times of London, Gillian Tunkel wrote to say, "I have never forgotten the comment that John's English literature teacher wrote to John's parents at the end of one of John's essays when John was 14. I am not sufficiently equipped to mark this." People who didn't know my father might have assumed that someone as erudite and bookish as he was might somehow be deficient in common sense or worldly wisdom. Nothing could be further from the truth. He had unerring judgment and good sense in matters great and small. He was unfailingly kind and sensitive too. He was always courteous and patient. I've never heard him be rude to anyone. He was immensely generous in every way, especially with his time and with his knowledge and advice. He would spend hours on the phone with people he hardly knew who had rang to pick his brain. And as one of his many friends who have written to me said, he never looked over anyone's shoulder at a party. He remained friendly and totally unpompous to the end. 2 days before he died, when I was urging the staff at St Mary's Paddington, which is the hospital in London, to do all they could to comfort him, a West Indian nurse said to me, "Oh, we all know about Mr. Gross. He is the best conversationalist we've ever had here." My father's intellect was also intact until his final days. When he was almost unconscious, one of the doctors said to him, "Mr. Gross, we are moving you now from the Samuel Lane ward to the Zachary Coke ward." And my father, with his eyes still shut, suddenly mumbled, "Ah, Dr. Zachary Cope, the famous abdominal expert, who wrote an article about Jane Austen's last illness." My father loved London. He delighted in taking visitors round tours of the East End and literary and other places of interest elsewhere. As one American friend, Roger Kimball, wrote to me yesterday, John knew the city as well as any London taxi driver. Better, in fact, because he could not only take you to any address he named, but he also knew what had happened there from the time of Julius Caesar until the day before yesterday. My father loved literature and theatre and all things English, but without being religious, he had an intense sense of Jewishness too, hence his childhood memoir, A Double Thread, and his groundbreaking study on the uses and misuses of the character Shylock over the last 400 years. He also had a very happy temperament and a great zest for life. And because of this, after my sister has spoken, and after the rabbi has offered the final prayers in Hebrew and said Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead, as we say goodbye to my father, we will conclude with an uplifting song, Tumbelalaika, that my father liked in Yiddish, the other ancient language spoken by Jews of East European origin, the culture, literature and theatre of which my father adored almost as much as he did English literature. One of the last lively conversations he had just before Christmas, when he was rushed to hospital by my mother, was to show visitors, with the greatest of pleasure, a rare Yiddish edition of Oscar Wilde. Everything will be duller and sadder without him. He was also, of course, a fantastic father. I couldn't have asked for a better father, and I feel privileged to be his son.
Wow.
So those are my words. I just want to add, since I didn't mention New York and the funeral address in London, he also loved New York. He had a wonderful time here, just down the road from where we are now. He loved the city, he loved his friends here, he loved all of you, and that was a very important part of his life too, a very rich life he lived. So if one or two of you want to say a few remarks, I would be happy, and I think Jack wanted to say something. Jack used to be at the New York Times or something.
I'm Jack Schwartz. I first met John when he had been working on the culture desk at the Times. He'd actually been imported from London to put a little class, a little stature and stability into a book review. And after a few months of that, he wisely came down to the, well, not so wisely, down to the culture desk. He had remarks, but they were always very kind of kind. Nevertheless, he was very worried about our new computer system. This was now 30 years ago. And as talented as he was sort of a little tentative about getting onto it. So I would sign him on in my name. And the powers that be, there was a fellow named Howard Angioni, and he was the computer maven. Maven, actually, he was this very tough guy. And he was very angry about anyone not signing in by themselves and learning the computer. And John just was not ready for this. So he would sign in under my name. One day, and then he would sort of move over and he began work. Of course, his work was wonderful, but he couldn't sign in. One day, Howard Angioni walks by, we were sort of like in the middle of the city room, and he sees me signing on for John's name. And it was like being, caught with a member of the Coldstream Guards embarrassing in a bathroom. And he lit into us, what are you doing? And John, as you know, is such a gentle and decent, and this guy just, really was a bully. And he said, you can't do this, on and on and on. And I finally told him to buzz off in rougher language, and he threatened to report both of us. And he actually did. He went to Abe Rosenthal, and of course I saw Abe, went out later, and he said, forget it, it was unnecessary. And we sort of became friends after that. I was his editor both at the culture section and also at the arts and leisure section. And I say editor it's a kind of the wrong word because John didn't need editing. I would occasionally change one or two words, and he'd be so grateful because it didn't need changing. But he was very humble, very generous. And then one day he'd walk by my desk in arts and leisure, and someone they were messing up a poem, and I knew this was wrong. He said, "What's the matter, Jack?" And I just told him. He said, "Oh, that's Gray's Elegy in a Churchyard." And he just sort of did the whole poem, and of course he said it right. Later on, I was book editor at New York Newsday. He did it was the 200th anniversary of the Britannica, and he did a review of this. And I realized that when he was citing all these different things, whether it's G.K. Chesterton or Thomas Carlyle or John Stuart Mill, he just knew it from the top of his head. He wasn't actually, I mean, he looked at it, but he knew it. But he did it in the most gracious and really kind of humble way. And then he had, and even when he was being a little tough, he referred to our Times editors of many years ago as Potash and Perlmutter, and name who they are, but some of you can guess. And again, but he had a very kind of gentle, imp-like way of really skewering and sending people up without hurting them, and that's not easy to do. And there was this kind of a generosity while he was saying, okay, this is what they are. And I was rereading the Rise of the Man of Letters the other day, and you know, and again, very gracious, very generous, but he has an essay on F.R. Leavis, and he's very tough. And I realize, you know, Leavis, as some of you may know, really was a bit of a, well, he was a bit of a dictator in terms of, you know, this is the way reviewing should be, and he dominated British literature, critical reviewing for many years. And John wasn't going to have this, and it was probably the toughest thing I think he ever wrote. But he didn't like bullies, and in a nice way, in a very nice way, he said so. He was generous, but he wasn't a softie, and I think that he was willing to stand up for things too, and he often did. And people sometimes forget that. And that I mentioned Potash and Perlmutter in the same breath as this review of Leavis, which is very telling. Finally, as Tom very nicely said, John really loved Yiddishkeit, and we would always sort of go back and forth in at least two languages. He, as Dr. Sunday, he took myself, my wife Nell, and our kids on one of his famous tours that goes from Whitechapel to Whitehall, but with the accent on the Whitechapel and the Old East End, and that dock area which had been bombed, you know, during the Blitz. And he was just wonderful in terms of saying, and this was a little Huguenot factory, and this was Beavis Park, and all the old sort of the Jewish atmosphere of his youth, and he was wonderful on that. Although we wound up at the Savoy, of course, but we did pretty well. And that was the thing, and I think that the idea of which he's written so beautifully, I mean, the double thread, that his life really was a double thread, and he really sewed it so beautifully and brought, I think, grace and humility and generosity to this double thread, and we will miss him.
Roger Kimball, the editor of the New Criterion, who unfortunately can't be here today, has very, very kindly put together this pamphlet of some of the tributes to my father, in case you haven't got that.
Oh, here, the red.
Yes, the red one. So I just wanted to thank